Welcome to the program. It is a milestone episode of the Brian J. Matos podcast because we have our very first guest. And I can't think of a better person to join us on our quest of curiosity as we embark on a mission that we talked about a couple of episodes ago about asking the best questions of the smartest people we can find on the most important topics in our world. And with that in mind, joining us today will be Dr. Mark Williams. He is a neuroscientist, a professor of neuroscience. We will go into his biography in a moment, but today's episode is going to feature an in-depth conversation on our brains, how we learn, how children learn, how technology is impacting us, how technology is starting to create addictive behaviors that may have societal level impacts in years to come. It's a fascinating interview. I had a chance to spend about an hour with Dr. Williams. I hope you will stick with me through the duration of the show because we have a lot of important topics to get to. Before we get to the interview, a quick reminder of how to learn more about this program. You can find more on this interview and all of our episodes at brianjmatos.com, where I also have a blog and I update you on some of our upcoming episodes. And I also try to share some insights from the show that I had following the interview and a few reflections of my own on the topics that we're going to discuss today. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always do that by email, info at brianjmatos.com. Find me on Twitter at brianjmatos. You can find me on Facebook, brian.matos. I have an Instagram, Brian J. Matos, and clips of this and every episode will be available on YouTube. Simply search Brian J. Matos Podcast or find me at Brian J. Matos Podcast, and you will find my YouTube channel. Without further ado, let's get to the interview and introduce Dr. Williams. Welcome to the program. Today, my guest joining us from Sydney, Australia is Dr. Mark Williams, an internationally recognized professor of cognitive neuroscience with over 25 years of experience conducting behavioral and brain imaging research focusing on our social skills. He's taught the fundamentals of neuroscience to a wide range of undergraduate and postgraduate students, as well as publishing more than 70 scientific articles. He's been awarded numerous high-profile fellowships and grants, and worked both at MIT in the United States and top universities in Australia. He studied brain plasticity, attention disorders, autism, dementia, eating disorders, and a wide variety of other topics, and has been at the cutting edge of developing computational brain imaging analysis and the adoption of new technologies like virtual reality in research. He now runs programs for schools and businesses on the neuroscience of learning, the neuroscience of emotions, and the impact of modern technologies, including smartphones, on our brains. In this episode, we'll discuss how educational theories for today's children may be doing more harm than good, and dive into a few other fascinating areas of this topic of neuropsychology. So, Dr. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
So many topics that we could cover in here, but I do think the education element is so critical to education systems around the world, some of which I think we all acknowledge have fallen behind, and in the post-pandemic world, unfortunately, critically fallen behind. So I want to begin there by thinking about the post-pandemic environment and the education systems that we've had going in, and then we'd had this big experiment with remote learning that seemed to not go very well for many schools around the world. And now we're coming out of that, and many education experts feel like we're digging out of a hole. And we may be digging out of a hole with tools that we had that got us into it in the first place. So to set the foundation, set the table for our discussion today, I'd love to get your initial thoughts on what you think is working and maybe was working in the education system even before we went through the pandemic, what hasn't been working, and then how you feel the pandemic ultimately exacerbated some of the challenges, and how we have to rethink about schooling today.
Yeah, great question. Huge question.
we dig into the deep ones here.
Yeah, wow. Let's start with the positive. So what I think was working, I think unfortunately there's a lot of chatter, or was a lot of chatter, and still is a lot of chatter about suggesting that the school system was broken before we went into the pandemic. And I don't think it was broken. I think it was maybe it copped a lot of flack from a lot of different angles, and I think that was really sad. And therefore, teachers, I don't think, are respected or weren't respected as much as they should be. And I think teachers should be respected a lot more than they are. I mean, these guys are spending day in, day out educating the next generation, and this next generation is going to determine what the world's like in the next 50, 60, 70 years. And I think we should appreciate that more, and we should actually give these people a lot more acknowledgement for what they're actually doing. I think there's a lot of talk, at least there's a lot of talk here in Australia, and I think there's a lot of talk in the US as well, about increasing wages for teachers. And although I think that would be great, and I got no problem with that, I also think that increasing wages isn't what's needed in schools. I think teachers get into teaching because they love teaching and because they want to be great teachers. And so we need to give them the time to do that. And I think that's what's really lacking in our schools these days is teachers don't have the time to actually spend time with the children, actually teaching the kids. And with the teenagers and actually teaching the kids. And that's what's really needed. And that we know that we learn from people, and that's something that we've evolved to do, and we evolved over millions and millions of years to actually learn from people within our in-group. And that happens really, really easily. And so we need to give teachers time to establish that in-group within their classes so that they can actually teach the students, because we don't learn from people who aren't part of our in-group. So if you don't establish that, you're not going to actually start teaching. And then once they've established that in-group, they've had time to establish that in-group, then give them time to actually teach what the students need to learn. And what students really need to learn is how to read, how to write, and how to do arithmetic, right? Those are the things that are actually essential for later on when you get to university. When I present at schools, I always say, what's number one thing that I, as a neuroscientist who has 1,000 first-year students, would want my students to be most capable at? And you get the hands up and say, oh, chemistry or physics or coding or whatever. And it's like, no, none of those things. I want them to be able to read, because I'm going to assign them a textbook and they're going to have to read that textbook, and it's a bloody thick textbook that they've actually got to read. And so the most important thing for somebody who wants to do neuroscience is to be able to read really, really well, fluently, and have a really good and wide vocabulary. And it doesn't matter what subject you're going to do at university, you've got to be able to read well. You've got to be able to understand what you're reading and be able to write notes well and actually do those things. So that's what we're missing. I think we're missing the point that school is about teaching kids the ability to learn, and that ability comes from being able to read and write and do arithmetic, to do maths. And all these extra programs that we keep lumping on teachers is just making their lives more difficult, and we need to stop doing that so that they can get back to what's really important, which is actually teaching kids the important things in life, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic.
So, as we think about how children learn, this is, I think, where you have a unique insight and some unique perspectives about making sure that we are offering education to kids at all grade levels in a way that makes the most sense for them and that they're able to digest that information. And so often we see kids reach a certain grade, they start to fall a little bit behind. And maybe it's just because that particular teacher or that particular coursework is a little bit of a struggle for them. And they either recover quickly, and we find the right mix of them, and sometimes that means tutoring, or sometimes they really go off the path, and they begin to really dislike the process of schooling. Talk to me a little bit about, from a scientific perspective too, what's happening in that process as children are either learning to really love the schooling process, or at a certain point it starts to become stressful and anxiety ridden for them.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it's all about connection. So we talk a lot in schools about engagement and getting kids engaged in the topic, but engagement really just refers to one topic or one project or one idea that you're actually working on. Whereas what I talk about is engagement, and that is, sorry, connection. And when I'm talking about connection, I mean connection to both the classroom, the teacher within that classroom, and also the school as a whole, and actually becoming connected to that. We probably all remember that teacher that we did have a connection with, and because of that connection we actually learnt much better and we actually enjoyed that subject. And we can probably, many of you can remember that teacher that you didn't get along with, that was a pain in the butt, and you didn't learn, right? You didn't actually want to be in the class, you didn't want to actually listen to them, and you probably started messing up in that class, or at least not actually learning as well as you could, and your grades would have actually slipped on that. And that's the most important aspect of teaching, is making that connection with the students, and then they'll actually learn from you. And we know that's the most important aspect of it, because we as humans didn't become this alpha species where we're able to live anywhere in the world we want to live and we can actually change the environment. We didn't do that because we're the strongest or the smartest or the most capable of the animals out there. We did that because we have evolved to collaborate and to communicate and to socialize and to connect. And so most of our brain is actually dedicated and has evolved to allow us to connect, to allow us to actually understand what somebody else is thinking, understand who they are, understand whether they're part of our in group or not part of our in group. If they're not part of our in group, we don't actually listen to them in the same way. We actually hear them differently. We find them less attractive. We're more likely to want them to be heard. If they're part of our in group, we listen to them. We hear what they're saying. We hear the positive things that they're saying differently to the negative things that they're saying. We find them more attractive and we're more likely to actually learn from them. So we actually attend to them and then we learn from them. And so if a teacher isn't part of the student's in group, then the student hears what they're saying differently, focuses on the negative things that the teacher's actually saying, doesn't find the teacher attractive or someone they want to actually listen to or be in the same room as, and they're not going to actually learn from them. And that makes really good sense from an evolutionary point of view, because you can imagine when we're in little groups and tribes and moving around and actually trying to find food, and it was a really dangerous environment. You didn't want to learn really easily from someone who wasn't part of your in group, because they could teach you something that you actually wasn't good for you to learn. And so we've evolved this really good system for identifying who's part of our in group, who we can therefore trust, and therefore who we can actually learn from. And we learn really, really quickly and really easily from people we're actually part of their in group. I mean, you look at a baby can learn from what we call two trial. And what I mean there is when a baby first sees a dog and their carer, who they've got a connection with, points to the dog and says dog, the child automatically comes up with two hypotheses. Either that is an item dog, that thing's name is dog, or that's a whole category of things called dogs, and I'm going to see lots more of them in the future. Then the next time the carer points at a dog and says dog and it's a different dog, the baby automatically goes, oh, that's a whole group of dogs that are out there that I'm going to see lots more of them, and therefore it's a category rather than its name. It's not an item, it's a category. To do that with a computer, you need to run thousands and thousands of trials of cats and dogs through the computer for it to learn the same thing. Yet a baby can learn from a carer automatically, just like that, like in two trials, which is quite phenomenal when you think about it. And that's because they have that connection, because a baby can automatically recognize it, where that carer is pointing is towards a dog, that carer is somebody that they trust because they're part of the in-group, and therefore they can trust what they're actually saying, and because they can make that distinction between those two different hypotheses and come up with the answer. So it's quite amazing, but you need that connection first, and that's what we've really got to focus on.
When we think about connections and we think about, as you put it, the in groups, so does that cut along? I think about all the tribes we could belong to. Does that cut along regional lines? Does it cut along national lines? Does it cut along even the familiarity of family versus neighbor versus community? When you think of in-group, what is that definition in the educational sense? And how does that influence maybe how we think about policy in the education space, putting teachers in classrooms that do share that sense of an in-group?
We have groups that we belong to, and they're all different levels, and they change constantly. And so we've got to realize that they do change. So you have sporting groups that you'll be an in-group of. I barrack for Geelong Cats, which is an Aussie rules football team, and I have jerseys and all the rest of it associated with Geelong Cats. And if I meet someone who's a Collingwood supporter, I probably don't feel as though I'm part of their in-group, and so therefore I'm not going to listen to them, and I don't like what they have to say about football. But then if I'm at the university, for example, then I'm going to have associations with different universities. When I was at MIT and I was working at MIT, I bought MIT jerseys and all the rest of it, and I still have a very strong affiliation with MIT as a college. And so I feel part of that group as well. And when I hear of people from Caltech, for example, I have this automatic little, response, which is, oh, that's not a great school, which of course it is, but that's my automatic reaction to that. But then at the same time, as an academic, which is a much wider group that I'm a member of, I have an affiliation with all academics. no matter where they are in. But I also have an affiliation with all educators, which would go across, different year levels and primary school teachers and high school and all educators, right? And so that's a much bigger group. So these groups can expand or increase or decrease depending on what you're actually doing. And there's a great study that was done in the UK. In the UK, their football fans are fanatical and they actually hurt each other if they run into each other. People have died and they've had riots and all the rest of it. What they did in the study was they just got individuals in who were, for example, Liverpool supporters, and they talked about Liverpool and how awesome Liverpool was, and then they let these people go and they just viewed what happened as they left, and they actually had a researcher come from the other side and walk across the road, and they were in the jersey of another football team, Manchester, for example. So they had a Manchester jumper on, and as they were walking across the road, they dropped something on the floor. Now, if they were in different jerseys, then that Liverpool, the person who was in the experiment would actually just walk past and wouldn't actually help the person, even though they dropped something, because they're in a different jersey. If they're in the same jersey, then they'd actually stop and actually help them, which is what we'd probably expect. But what was really interesting was that they then did a second experiment where they turned around and said, all right, let's talk about the UK league, so the league that actually encompasses both Liverpool, for example, Liverpool and Manchester, versus the European league, which covers a whole bunch of other. And they found when they did that, and you had a Liverpool person, and they've been talking about the UK league and how amazing it was compared to the European league. And then they left the room, and it was a Manchester person walking towards them with a Manchester jumper, and they dropped it. Then they'd actually help them and start talking to them because they felt as though they were part of their group. So our groups actually change based on the situation and based on what we've actually just been thinking about. So we can actually alter those things. So it's not necessarily fixed, most of those things. Some are, of course. Some, for example, race, you can't change your race, and so therefore you can't change. But you can change the way you think about it. So rather than thinking about, I'm Caucasian, I could think about it, I'm a human, right? And then that actually encompasses everybody rather than just encompassing this small group of the one race that I'm actually a part of. So we can change how big our groups are. But yeah, when we're actually thinking about who we're going to put into classrooms, for example, we need to think about who the demographic of that classroom is, and so therefore who's going to relate to those kids most easily. Because us as adults can think about it and be taught, yes, we can change our groups and make them larger or smaller. But kids aren't that easily manipulated, if you like. And so we need to think about how we can make it easiest for them or easiest for the teacher to connect with those kids in some way. And by doing that, it helps. But also just by the teacher actually being honest and vulnerable, by going into the classroom and just explaining who they are, because a lot of teachers, I find, are scared to actually be vulnerable and tell the kids that, hey, I'm a human too. I make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to be grumpy some days. I'm going to be happy some days. And that's got nothing to do with you guys, but, talk to me about it if it happens. And actually being vulnerable in that situation, because then they can attach to the teacher. They can then go, hey, this person's just like me and has really bad days and has really good days. And sometimes he's struggling and sometimes isn't. And also talk about things that they can relate to, which is harder these days because a lot of teachers grew up when there wasn't, all these devices and everything around, whereas kids are growing up with constant, on devices and all the rest of it. So sometimes it's more difficult, but we can all relate to, football teams that we're fans of or that we're not fans of. There's always things that we can always bring up and talk about that can make that connection. But yeah, it is really important to think about how do we make that connection? How do we ensure that the teacher that's in the classroom can relate to the kids and the kids can actually connect to that teacher so they can start learning?
Yeah, you bring up one of the really important topics around connectivity is when you get to know somebody, and sometimes it's a story and sometimes it's an experience. And the more you just get to know that element of someone's life beyond their job title or sort of how their role in the classroom, their official role in society. What is the evolutionary advantage of that? I feel like this is a phenomenon that is universal around the world. The more I get to know about your background, the more I care about you, the more I invest in you, the more I listen to you. But is there some specific reason why that element of storytelling and connecting in that way overcomes other issues that might otherwise separate people?
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the things we've got to realize is that storytelling is much stronger for us than reading, or because reading something that we've only just recently been able to do. So the majority of people have only learned how to read in the last generation or two. So it's not something our brains have evolved to do. So we don't do it automatically. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to read. So you've got to really be committed to reading something to actually really want to do that and be committed to it. Whereas storytelling is something we've been doing for much longer. And we did storytelling even before we had complex language, because we would have done it with gestures and so on, and we would have done it with pictures and those sorts of things. So storytelling is a very old way of communicating with each other through gestures, but also through language. And it's evolved to allow us to connect. So it's evolved to allow us to actually associate each other or work out whether that person's part of my in group or not part of my in group. So that's why storytelling works really, really well. And the best leaders out there are always the ones that are vulnerable, who are willing to give insights into their own lives and are willing to actually tell those stories about their lives. And if they're relatable, then they become greater leaders, because people really connect to them and really feel as though they're part of their in group. And so storytelling is really important. And yeah, teachers need to learn how to do it, and leaders need to learn how to do it. We all need to really learn how to do it. Whenever I do a presentation, I always start with a story about myself, because I want to make that connection first. And I want people to actually relate to me first, and then I'll start the presentation, because no one's going to listen to me unless they actually know a little bit about me and have some sort of connection with me.
Is there any particular time in life where it's easier to learn that skill? Because I don't know that that's something we're inherently programmed with, the ability to tell a story. In fact, some people really struggle with it, and they have to take extensive coursework just to try to be a good public speaker in that regard. And then for others, it seems to come to them as just a part of their life. They have the gift of gab. They know how to articulate every little detail about something that happened, and they captivate us. Is there anything in the scientific research or literature or anything about whether this is a learned skill that we all can acquire, or is it something more innate that some people have this ability from birth better than others?
There's not a huge amount of research. I would say, number one, it's got to be learned, because it's too complex for us to actually have evolved it. We only have a really limited number of genes that are actually passed on to us from our parents, and those genes are what determine, basically the scaffolding of what happens to us. But the vast majority of how we turn out is actually due to learning, not actually due to our genes. So most of what we are able to do and not able to do is because of learning, not our genes. And there's been a huge emphasis on our genes over the last 20 years, and it's a misinterpretation of the impact that our genes actually have on us, because our genes don't really have that much of an impact on us. They do have on the size that we'll be, and the colour that we'll be, and the colour of our eyes, and whether or not we'll go bald as we go older, so like I did, and those things, but not really when it becomes to behaviour, and not when it comes to intellect and how intelligent we'll be later on. Those things come from learning and come from having good environments that we actually learn in. So I would say that this ability to tell good stories is learned. And I think kids, especially younger kids, have that ability, because most younger kids want to sit down and tell you a story. Most younger kids want to have your attention, and once they got your attention, they'll go on for ages. And even what we call shy kids who have learned to be shy, it's not something that's genetic, it's actually something that they've learned to be. If you actually get one-on-one with them and actually make a connection with them, it's amazing how much they'll go on and on and on, and sometimes you can't really shut them up. So I think the ability to tell a story is taught out of us rather than something that we don't learn. I think a lot of us actually get taught that we shouldn't be talking a lot, and that we shouldn't, be talking about ourselves, and we're giving them too much information, and we need to be more quiet. We need to be less open about our lives and stuff. And so that's why we learn not to do it. And that's why we feel guilty when we do it, when we stand up and try to actually do it, because we have this automatic response, which is, I shouldn't be doing this because I've been taught over a long period of time that this is personal and I shouldn't be telling everyone about it. So yeah, I think it's learned out of us rather than actually something that we don't learn. And so I think we need to give kids more time to actually talk. But I don't think we should give kids more choices. I think that's one of the things that's gone wrong in our society. I think we spend too much time asking kids and asking teens what they want and how they want to be taught, and then what programs that they want to be running. And we've got to realise that they don't have the ability to do that yet because they don't have the experience yet. And this is one thing that I think is really missing in our society is older generations actually teaching younger generations. We've got peer groups, and kids associate with peer groups and have in-groups within peer groups, but not across peer groups. And I think that's something that really needs to change.
Let's dig into that a little bit more. So when we talk about across peer groups, there's a lot of different ways to consider that. And I think one of the challenges around the world is you bring the schools to where the communities are. And in many parts of the world, communities are naturally segregated on racial lines, religious lines, economic lines. And so what communities you do get are sort of reinforcing the environment that they're in, because we need to make the schools accessible to kids in a local community, but they may not get an exposure to somebody from a different background or a different religion or a different race or a different socioeconomic background. That may not happen for some until they go to college, if they go to college. So what are some of the things you've seen that either work internationally, maybe things that you've been part of consulting for, that give kids in that sort of elementary through middle school, high school level, the opportunity to see across different peer groups, even though that may not be innate to the school that they attend or even to the neighborhood that they live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a tough one because, I mean, I live on the northern beaches of Sydney, which is called the Insular Peninsula because it is very insular. And there's not many people from outside of here because it's a wealthy area and it's on the beaches, and there's a lot of surfers and a lot of people who like to live in houses that look over the water. So it's something that I worry about with my own kids. I think one of the things that I've seen work really well is there's an organisation called Upschool.co, and they organise for schools, primary schools and high schools, but for groups within the school to raise funds to build a library or a school for a less fortunate area. And it can either be a less fortunate area in their country or in another country, and so they organise that. But part of that is actually getting to know the kids in that other school as well. So they're not just raising funds to actually build a library, they're also raising funds. They're also spending time talking to the kids and talking to the teachers in those schools about what they actually need and how they live their lives and how they get to school and all those things which are really important for that as well. And I think that's a really cool way to actually enable kids to have a more varied education, or at least experiences outside of their normal school. And they have a lot of other programs as well around that. And so I think that's a cool way to do it. If you can have some setup where the school that's in a wealthy area can have a sister or brother school in another area which is poorer, and they can have some sort of link between the two. But it needs to be real and it needs to go both ways. I have seen where there's been, well-to-do schools and they've set up a situation like that, and then they've had scholarships and they've brought kids in to their school, and that doesn't work because these kids they feel, out of place, right? It's like I'm all of a sudden in this wealthy school that I've never seen. They've got a pool and they've got blah and they've got gym and all the rest of it. I come from this other school over the other side of town that doesn't have any of these things, and it can work occasionally, but it's much harder. And so it really needs to be both ways. And you really need to have that relationship going both ways if you're going to make that work. But it is really important. And it's also important that we realise that things like racism, for example, which is a huge issue in a lot of societies, it's a huge issue in all societies, because our brains have actually set up in a way, it didn't evolve to be racist, but it actually ends up that way because of the way societies are set up. So our face template, which is in our fusiform face area, part of our brain, it's actually the way we identify who people are is based on this template, which is actually a matching system. Because all our faces are very similar, it's hard to actually identify each individual. That template is actually an average of all the faces we see. And so we know that if you see a real varied number of faces from lots of different races, your face template is much wider than somebody who sees the one race all the time. Now, the issue is that we all grow up in families where it's the same race, because it's got to be the same race, right? And so the face that we see most is our race to begin with. And then that often continues because often we're associated with the same race mainly. And so our face template is usually biased, strongly biased towards our race. Now, that face template actually determines what we orient to and what we actually recognize most easily. So when somebody comes into a room and they're of a different race, we automatically orient to them because of that face template, because that face template says that's not a person who's an average of your face template. It's different. It deviates from that. So you've got to orient to that person because they're a member of your out group, even though they may not be a member of your out group, even though you might know them. So you orient to them really quickly, and that sets off your fight or flight response, which increases your heart rate. We also don't recognize somebody who's more deviates more from that face template, from our average, which means we don't recognize people from other races as well, and we're more likely to misidentify people from other races. So we're going to orient to somebody who's not the average of our faces, and we're going to misidentify them later on, which causes a lot of issues in society. So we know countries where they mainly see the same race, such as Japan, have the worst cases of racism than any other country in the world because of that template, because that template is really, really narrow, and therefore they're always, have a negative response, that response to faces which aren't part of that template. Whereas more homogeneous societies, where there's more variation, you have a more wide template, and therefore you don't have those responses in the same way. So what we need to do is everybody needs to be looking at lots and lots of different faces, and it will actually dampen down that face template. It'll actually make it much wider. So we're not having those automatic responses that we don't realize we're having. This isn't something that you're conscious of. So therefore you need to actually, perceive lots and lots of faces, and that will actually help dampen down that automatic response that we have in our face template.
So let's bring technology into the conversation, because this is
Okay.
where I think there'll be a lot of opinions from even our audience about the impact that it's having. Let's start with what we just talked about, the association of faces, seeing lots of faces. First and foremost, does it make a difference whether those faces are in person or through a screen? And I ask this because we do have a lot of kids today who are exposed to an inordinate amount of media, social media, traditional media. I mean, they are getting bombarded with images, but I assume there is a difference in how our brains perceive those images when they're seen through the context of a screen or a phone versus when we see them in the real world and we can interact with them as 3D figures. First of all, I guess the question is there a difference? And secondly, what impact do you feel like that amount of technology on young minds is having in their ability to learn and to associate with other people?
A great question. We could go on for hours about this one. So, so let's get to the first question. So the first question, is there a difference between seeing someone on a screen versus seeing someone in real life? And there's a huge difference between the two things. And the reason, it's multifaceted. So one of the reasons is that when you see someone on a screen, such as we're talking to each other now, you don't get all the really good neurotransmitters that we actually need to actually connect with each other. So when we see each other on a screen like this, what the main neurotransmitter that's released is dopamine, which we all know about dopamine, how important it is. But we don't get things like serotonin and oxytocin, which are really, really important for us to actually connect. So when we meet in real life, when we actually in the same room as each other, you and I would probably greet each other. We'd smile at each other, which is really important because that is contagious. So you actually, when you smile at someone else, you activate the mirror neuron system, which actually activates their muscles in their face, which means that they actually get the same response as you for the smile, and so you actually feel happy about actually seeing this person, and you actually will then smile back pretty automatically. And so that's a positive aspect to it, but you get that on the screen as well because you're both on the screen. And that's the release of dopamine that I was talking about. But also we actually touch each other appropriately, of course, but we touch each other. So in all societies, we have some way of touching each other when we actually greet. In more stoic societies like the US and here in Australia, we'll shake hands because it's appropriate way of actually touching each other. In Europe, of course, they'll kiss each other on the cheeks. Even the Inuits, because the only part of their body that's actually showing is their face, they'll rub noses so that they're touching their skin. The reason we touch skin is that we as primates have C fibers in our skin. There are special fibers in our skin which are just there for touch, and they actually activate an area of our brain which releases oxytocin. And oxytocin actually makes us more likely to connect with someone, more open to actually making a relationship with that person, and more open to trusting that person. It's what's released when women are breastfeeding, for example. It's what's released when we have an orgasm, and it's released when we touch each other on those C fibers. And that's why we actually do those things like shaking hands and so on. That is really crucial for making a real connection with someone. But you don't get that when you're online because you can't touch each other unless we start rubbing each other. But that doesn't work anywhere near as well as actually touching in real life. So that's really, really important aspect to actually being face to face with someone. There's also the added bonus of the pheromones. So we have pheromones that are released from each other that actually, again, help us to connect to the other person. And so those are chemicals in the air that go through our noses and through our mouths, and it activates different parts of our brains and tells us who this person is and whether or not we like this person, and a lot of other things as well, which is really important as well for that connection. So those things are really important for actually making the connection. The other thing, we now know that people actually think that someone likes them more or is willing to connect more closely with someone when they do it face to face because they've made the effort to actually do that. Because it actually takes effort to go and actually meet someone. And so it actually brings people closer together, especially these days, because people are like, well, intrinsically, it's not something you explicitly think, but it's intrinsically you think this person actually made an effort. They're actually come out of their house or they've come out of their office to actually meet me and interact with me. So that also adds to that connection and adds to all those really happy neurotransmitters that we receive when we're actually meeting someone face to face. We don't get any of that when we're actually online connecting with each other. And the other problem, of course, is most kids and teenagers don't actually do Zoom or Skype or any of those things, right? They're on social media where they're seeing pictures of people, and they're static pictures. So they're not getting all the movement associated with actually connecting with someone. And when we're talking to someone like you and I are, we get the prosody and all those things of the voice, which actually change based on whether you're happy or you're sad or you're keen or whatever. And you don't get any of that information either. And then another thing you don't get when you're online is you don't get the body language. So you and I can only really see above our waist here. We don't really know what's going on below there. And we actually get a lot of information from body language when we're actually associating with someone, when we're actually talking to someone face to face, whether they're slumped forward or whether they're sitting up. Whereas we all tend, when we're on Skype, to sit as neatly as we can. And we're looking at each other ourselves as well. So we're constantly monitoring that. Whereas when you're actually with someone, you're not looking at yourself. So you're not monitoring how you're looking. So therefore, you're more likely to go into body language positions, which are going to tell them stuff that you wouldn't normally get. So those are, I think I've run them through about 5 or 6 different aspects that are different when you're actually face to face. And being face to face, like real face to face with someone, activates more of your brain than anything else we can do. If you actually want to be an intelligent individual, the best thing you can do is sit down and chat to someone, because that's going to activate more of your brain than anything else you can do in your life, because our brains have evolved to actually socialize, because that's our most crucial and most important asset that we have. That's what we do better than any other animal, is socialize and collaborate and connect with each other. And so more of our brain is dedicated to that. So by actually doing that, you activate more of your brain, which means that you keep your brain stronger and it becomes healthier by actually doing that. But we don't get that when we're online because of all those things that aren't actually happening. And then there's a lot of negative things that happen when we're online, which we can talk about as well. But I'll probably leave it there if you if you want to keep going.
Yeah, so we'll move on in a moment. I do want to circle back though to close the loop on that last question though, because I think you gave a very good summary there of what we miss when we're online. But is there any aspect of, let's say, 13-year-old kids? They live in a fairly insular environment. Maybe they don't have a lot of exposure to the outside world. Maybe they don't travel, but they are exposed to more diverse points of view through, again, social media, through maybe they even have a program like this where they can connect through Zoom with children from a different socioeconomic background or a different part of the community. It's not going to be the same effect as being in person, but is there some effect of breaking down those walls of in-group, out-group, if at least they're getting some of that exposure through digital means in the absence of being able to do that more holistically in person?
Cool question. So if we set it up properly, there is a huge benefit. So I was talking about upschool.co, for example, and they do a lot of their stuff online because obviously they do a lot of stuff in India and Asian countries, and so they'll connect Western countries with Asian countries, and that's online, and that's an amazing opportunity for these kids to actually connect with people from different parts of the world. So if you do it consciously, yeah, awesome. The problem is that we now know that when people are online, they have access to less information than we did 10 years ago. And we have access to less diverse information now than we did 10 years ago because of the algorithms that run in the background of the social media and so on. So kids who are just on social media, or kids that are just on gaming platforms, or kids that are on YouTube, for example, they're actually becoming more narrow in their knowledge, and they're becoming more narrow in the connections they've got, and they're becoming more narrow in the faces that they see, and the people they see, and the opinions that they get if they're on those platforms, because those platforms are designed specifically to keep you on the platform. And the way you do that is you work out, well, those programs work out what this person is most interested in, and let's just push them in that direction and push them more and more extreme in that direction. And so that's what they'll do, and that's how they actually run. And so we know that these days we're becoming much more insular, and we have access to much less information than we ever have in the past because of the fact that the algorithms are pushing us in one direction. So it's awesome if you do it consciously and set up in situations where kids are actually meeting people from diverse backgrounds or meeting kids from other. That's great. But unfortunately, if you're just relying on multinational tech companies to do that for you, then they're doing the complete opposite because they want to keep your kids on the devices, and they do that by using algorithms and showing them stuff that is what they actually want to see, which is based on what they've seen previously, which means that it's becoming more and more narrow.
Yeah, so to your point, it's more insular. It's actually more of the in-group than it is an exposure to more of the world.
Yeah, those all of those social media programs and YouTube and everything are creating more narrow in groups, and bigger valleys between these in groups, which is a little scary.
So as we dive a little deeper into the technology aspect, this is a little bit hard for me to fully comprehend because I grew up and went through school without access to a lot of technology. I mean, we had computers, so I wasn't completely in the typewriter era, but certainly didn't have a smartphone in the classroom, didn't necessarily have ready access to all of the information that we have at home, was sort of sheltered in some way from the enormity of information that's at your fingertips. We didn't even have social media in any sophisticated way. And now you can be a 12-year-old kid and you've got the world in your fingertips if you have a smartphone. You certainly have access to online resources both in school, at home, and wherever you go. It must be having an effect on how kids are learning and how they see themselves in the world and even how they're developing relationships. I'm curious from the perspective of a neuroscientist and a professor who interacts with young people who have grown up with this technology. What are some of your observations about how it has changed learning and how it has changed kids and what it's like to be a kid?
trying to work out exactly how to tackle that because there's multiple different aspects to that question. So one aspect is we now know that so kids today, teenagers, we'll start with teenagers. Teenagers today, there's less teenage pregnancy, which is awesome, right? Kids aren't getting pregnant as early as they used to, which is really surprising. And there's less drug taking with teenagers these days. You may not realise it because the media often portrays it the other way, but it's actually true that there is less drug taking amongst teenagers than there was before we had all these devices, which is also really great. But there's more suicide, there's more depression, there's more anxiety because kids today and teenagers today are spending way more time now in their bedrooms on their devices than they are out socialising. So in the old days when I was young, there was no way I would stay home at night when I was a teenager, right? You'd get home from school and then you drop your bag and you go. Whereas these days, kids will actually go into their rooms because they're drawn to these devices, and so they go into their rooms and look at these devices, which is a concern because we also know that kids and teens have poorer facial expression perception ability than they used to have because of the fact that they're on these devices all the time. So, and they have less ability to socialize because they haven't learnt all those really important aspects of socializing, which is complicated and really difficult to learn, but you need to learn it to actually associate with people. And so we have higher anxiety rates because kids and teens are more anxious about going out and socializing because they don't know how to do it yet. They actually haven't learned how to do it yet. And so yes, there's the advantage that they're not getting pregnant anymore. They're not taking drugs to the rate they used to before. But the problem is that they have all these other issues associated with that, which I think are far worse, to be honest, in relation to socializing and collaborating and spending time with each other, because those are the 21st century skills that they actually need. So if you talk to any futurist, they'll usually talk about coding, which now that we have chat GPT, coding's gone out the window. You can just tell it to code you up whatever you want. I was playing with the other day and it'll code it all for you. So coding's off the board now, right? But all the other ones are all around emotional intelligence, around collaboration, about leadership, about being able to be innovative and work with other people and so on. All those things you need to learn by actually socializing with people, and teenagers and kids aren't doing those things anymore. So yes, they have access to these devices, which gives them access to lots of information, but they're not actually using it because we know kids have actually less access to information than they've ever had before because of the fact that we've got those algorithms running in the background. And B, they don't spend their afternoons or their evenings in their bedrooms on their devices, looking up how did Einstein come up with his theory of relativity. What they do is they're looking at Snapchat and they're looking at all these other social media platforms, or they're gaming, or they're on YouTube. And these things are causing really negative impacts on their development of their ability to socialize, their ability to actually communicate with people and having friends. So loneliness in schools has gone through the roof over the last 10 years, which is really, really sad. And things like suicide and depression and anxiety have also gone through the roof over the last 10, 15 years. As a result of the fact that kids aren't learning how to do those things. And there's a great study that they just simply took, they were year 7 kids, so they're around 12-year-olds, and they took them out on a camp just for 5 days, and they looked at their ability to perceive facial expressions and therefore emotional intelligence before they went on camp, and went on camp for 5 days where they didn't have access to any devices, and they came back and they tested their emotional intelligence and their ability to perceive facial expressions, and that it significantly improved over those 5 days. Now, they didn't do any programs. They didn't run, his facial expression, or anything like that. They just took them on a camp where they didn't have the devices, which means that their ability to do those things before that was significantly impaired because of the fact that they're on devices all the time. And so we need to realize that these things aren't actually benefiting in the way that we think they are. They could be, because there are lots of cool things that we could do, but the way not these tech companies have set them up and the way we often use them means that we're actually more isolated, and we're not actually learning a lot of the skills that we actually need to learn for when we're actually out there in the workforce and we're actually trying to be the next great leaders who are going to push our societies in great directions.
That's an interesting point too about that study that indicated that some of this is reversible. So I wanted to ask you next about that. Is that we are starting to develop patterns. I think if you're a kid who grew up with technology from the age of 8 or 9 or whenever you could start fiddling with it, and now you're a teenager, there's a lot of things that may be starting to get hardwired in you. So I wanted to ask you about that as these behaviors sort of become they get a momentum of their own, and you start to develop patterns of maybe a lack of ability to socialize the way that you otherwise would have in the absence of the technology. How much of it is reversible with, as we said, things like tech detox? Let's take the phone away from a week and just put you with people and see how you do. And how much of this could become permanent at a certain point in childhood development?
To be honest, we don't know, which is the biggest worry I think about all of this, because we've never done this before. This is a completely new experiment that we're running on a whole generation of kids. So that's the bit that really concerns me. We do know neuroplasticity is occurring all throughout our lives. So neuroplasticity just means that our brains are changing every day based on what we do and what we don't do. And so things that we do, positive things that we do, change our brains in a positive way, and negative things we do changes our brains in a negative way. And my brain today is different to what it was yesterday, and it'll be different again tomorrow, and we can change our brains constantly. So hopefully a lot of these abilities can be improved if the kids get off the devices and actually get out to the real world and actually do those things. And the suggestion from a lot of the research is that yes, that's possible, but we don't know if that's possible for all the kids or if that's possible for a percentage of the kids, because as I said, we've never done this experiment before. So, and it's a scary experiment that we're performing on the kids. So hopefully, because of neuroplasticity and because of the fact that our brains are always changing, that simply by flicking a switch and changing this, I always say we're at a crossroads and we've got to decide which way we're going to go, and hopefully we go the right way. But if we don't, can we go back, reverse in 20 years' time? We don't know, but I'm hoping because our brains are so plastic that we can, and we can actually change that at some time in the future. But it's going to be difficult. I mean, if you think about somebody, say, with addiction, that is a lifelong disease. And even if they get off whatever it is they're addicted to, they still suffer for the rest of their lives. They've still got to be aware of the fact that they can't touch that thing for the rest of their lives. And so even though, they are able to come back and they are able to change their brains, they still have that nugget in there that actually is causing harm, potentially harm if they ever go back to whatever it happened to be that they were addicted to. And we know that these devices are addictive, right? We know that social media is addictive, and we know that they're running programs that actually ensure that you stay on them as long as you can. And those are addictive programs. Those things are actually designed to keep you on them. And gaming is addictive. Gaming is now part of the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for psychiatrists and psychologists. And it is classified along with drug addiction and gambling addiction and alcohol addiction, and it's treated the same as those things. So we're giving kids the opportunity to use things that are just as addictive as those things, and I think that's something we need to be more aware of, and I think we need to actually start realizing that we need to do it a little bit differently. And I'm not saying get rid of the devices. I'm a neuroscientist, and they're my bread and butter, right? And I program in 6 different languages. So it's not something that I'm saying we should get rid of devices. I think they're awesome, and I think we can do some amazing things with them. But we need to actually use them for good, and we need to make sure what we're using them for is actually benefiting us, not just benefiting these multinational companies.
Yeah, and when you think about the implications on public policy, we've created a whole new category of potential addiction, which means a whole new category of treatment and all the medical expenses and societal expenses that can come with that. That is a huge issue. I'm curious if you think that the interactivity of things like cell phones and gaming is the critical piece, because we've had very nice televisions now for a long time. We interact with that. Maybe some of us spend too much time watching TV, but somehow we can turn it off. We can walk away from it. We can go on vacation, leave the remote behind. We don't interact with that quite as much. But television is a very passive experience. You're sort of consuming the media, but you're not engaging it. Is it the fact that when you're on a gaming device or when you're on social media or when you're on any form of media on your phone and you can engage back, is it that active engagement that really turns it from just a passive media consumption into something a little bit more behavioral and potentially more addictive?
Yeah, exactly right. So that's a huge component of it. So because you're actually interacting with it, it's something that is actually, it's not a passive thing like just watching TV. You know, we don't get addicted to TV. Well, you might get addicted to a particular series and binge watch it, but you know, you can then walk away and it doesn't really worry you. But whereas with the devices, you're actually interacting with it, which makes it more personal and therefore makes it more addictive for you as an individual. The other thing is that they're so good; those algorithms are so good at actually driving the information that we get. I mean, it's selected for you particularly, right? Whereas when you're watching a TV show, it's been programmed to capture a large audience of people, not just you. Whereas what you're actually receiving when you're on social media and what you're receiving when you're on YouTube and so on, that information has been curated for you as an individual, not for a large group of individuals, but it's been decided that you're the one that's going to most like this and most likely stay on this. And so therefore it's much more personal than when you're on a TV or when you're watching a TV show, which is for a general audience, whereas what you're receiving when you're on these things is much more personal. And then, of course, you've got things like likes um, and those comments and all those things, which are constantly being sent to you so that you're constantly reminded that you actually should be on it. So, you know, we've got things like fear of missing out, FOMO, and these things that we never had before. And that's all because of social media and so on, because of the fact that we've been driven by this. So, and then the third thing that is really crucial in all of this is that we have them on us all the time. Nobody walks around with a TV under their arm to work and then sits it on their desk beside them at work and has the TV on while they're actually trying to do their work and so on. Whereas with the smartphone, we now have it in our pockets 24 hours a day. I mean, there's something like 15-20% of people will actually stop having sex if their smartphone dings because they've got to check what's actually come through. I mean, that's insane, right? It's absolutely mind-boggling. Yeah. So yeah, because they're with us all the time, they've now become personal. And a lot of people treat them like a baby. In my recent book, I talk about the fact that a lot of people will actually treat them as though they're another member of their family, and actually, you know, have them with them all the time. They get stressed when they're not with them. They look after them like they're some sort of sentient being. And when they're not, it's just a device. It doesn't need to be responded to immediately, and you can actually put it away and go for a walk and come back, and it won't be upset with you if you do that. So yeah, those are the three really crucial aspects. And but you're right that one of them is that we do interact with these things, whereas we don't interact with TVs, which has caused a lot of issues.
Excellent. I've got one more question. We're coming up to the end of our hour here, but before I do, I want to give you a moment to talk about your website and talk about your upcoming book, right? And if you want to talk about any of the books that are already available for our audience, feel free.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have an upcoming book. It's out in August. It's pre-sales are now going, so you can pre-order it. It's called The Connected Species: How the Evolution of Our Brain Can Change Our World. It's a lot about a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, and a lot of other stuff as well. So if you're really interested in how we can connect better, and how we can become more connected as a species, or go back to the way we were connected before devices, pick up the book, because I think and I've got tips at the end of each chapter, so you can actually work through it as a family or as a corporation or as an organisation and actually change what you're actually doing so that you can actually improve how you're actually connecting with people and how you're connecting across groups. And then also, my website is drmarkwilliams.com. I have podcast on there if you want to listen to that, or I have a lot of other things on there as well. And my newsletter, you can sign up to my newsletter, which is a monthly newsletter, which just talks about a lot of the stuff we've been talking about and other things, and where I'm presenting and what I'm doing. So yeah, hopefully people will get on board and make us all more connected.
Absolutely. Sounds great. So, last question. What is the most exciting thing in your field? Maybe it's a cutting edge research. Maybe it's just something that you're seeing in your daily work with companies, with schools, or just something in the discovery process when you've been writing your book. What's new? What's cutting edge? What should we be keeping our antennas out for hearing more about in the coming maybe months and years?
I was on a think tank for Fujitsu a little while ago, and we were talking a lot about augmented reality, especially for people who can't get out of their homes. And that I think is a really cool area of research that I think is going to change what we how a lot of people see the world, but also how they're actually able to interact. It's going to really help older people who want to stay at home, but it's also going to help a lot of other people who might be more isolated at home and so on, because you can actually change the world around you without actually using something like virtual reality. So it's not that you completely shut yourself off, but you just augment the reality that you're actually seeing. And I think it has a lot of potential in a lot of different areas. I hope it's used for good rather than evil, and I think it will be. It's not the metaverse. It's got nothing to do with the metaverse. It's not even in that realm. But rather just being able to augment our own reality without actually spending money. So things like if you're wearing the glasses, you could just change the color of all your rooms just like that, and all your rooms are a different color. But it's your rooms, right? You're still walking around, you're still interacting with people, you're still doing all those things. Or you can just add another TV to the side and watch that, and somebody else can watch a different program while you're both sitting in the same room, and you can both still talk to each other, you can both still see each other, but you're watching different programs on the same TV. Because it's augmented, right? And so it's not that TV's not there for either of you, but for both of you, you're watching the same TV. Yeah, I think there's lots of potential for it, especially in regards to having older people staying at home and people who don't have as much mobility and so on. And yeah, it's a cool thing that has been developed for quite a while now. Hasn't really taken off yet, but I think it will be the next big area of research, hopefully. Because virtual reality isn't, I've done a lot of research in virtual reality, but it's not great because it can make you sick, it can make you vomit, which isn't great if you have those goggles on for too long, which, because of you've got a vestibular problem, which we can't get around. So there's an inconsistency between what you're actually seeing and what you're feeling, and your vestibular system's actually doing, which is why people get car sick and so on. And it's exacerbated when you're actually in virtual reality. So that's a big issue with virtual reality, whereas with augmented reality, you don't have that issue because you're actually seeing the real world. And so those things are in sync, if you like. But yeah, I think it's a really cool new, well, not that new, but I think it will be something which will change the world.
Fascinating. We may have to have you back to talk about that as it gets further along.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Excellent. It's been a great hour. I think I've learned a lot. Hopefully, our listeners have as well. Again, folks can find you drmarkwilliams.com if they want to learn more about your practice and about some of the resources you have available. And I'll encourage everybody to sign up for that newsletter as well.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks for having me along.
What a fascinating hour with Dr. Mark Williams. Thank you all for sticking with us. A quick reminder of how to get in touch with Dr. Williams, as well as how to get in touch with myself. So we mentioned drmarkwilliams.com. That is the primary way to get in touch with the good doctor. And of course, you can sign up for his newsletter, as we just mentioned there. But don't forget about us at the Brian J. Matos Show. I will make sure that the links to Dr. Williams' Facebook and LinkedIn account are available on my website, brianjmatos.com. We'll put those links in the show notes of this episode, so I encourage you to check those out. And we will promote this show on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We'll get some clips up so that you can share with friends and introduce them to the program, introduce them to the topics that we shared today. As a reminder, you can always reach me at info at brianjmatos.com. You can find me on Twitter at brianjmatos, Facebook brian.matos. I have an Instagram, Brian J. Matos, and YouTube as well, at Brian J. Matos Podcast if you're looking for my channel. Otherwise, just go to the search bar, search Brian J. Matos Podcast, and my clips will come up. I ask you to subscribe so that every time we post new clips and new episodes, you will be among the first to know. Thank you all for joining us today on this banner episode, this milestone episode with our very first interview. I hope that we've demonstrated for you the goals of the show, where we're going with it, that our objective is to ask some of the smartest people in the world, like Dr. Williams, about some of the most important topics, like how we learn and what's on the cutting edge of neuroscience. As well as ensuring that we're asking the best questions we can of those experts. So I want your questions as well, and if we get enough and they're compelling enough, we may bring Dr. Williams back on the program to cover some of those topics. Once again, thank you all for joining us. I look forward to hearing from you soon, and don't forget to stay curious.